If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. If you've listened to this podcast for very long, you know I'm fascinated with human performance and its particular kinds of performance, not like physical performance. And we'll get into why that is and what's going on there. But I'm just intrigued by how we go about getting better at things. And I don't think that there's a whole bunch of knowledge about this, and I'll explain my reasoning. But particularly when it comes down to work, how do we do work? How do we get better at work? I don't think there's a ton of knowledge out there, so I'm trying to, I don't know, move the needle a little bit here, get us some more information about this thing. We know that our work is stressful. We know that it's a problem. We know that work-life balance is an issue. We also know economically that we need to improve productivity. Labor productivity is flat for a little while. And as I've said many times before, according to Peter Drucker, if productivity is flat, then we cannot expect to enhance our standard of living in the long term. And so that's what we're all about. Add to that the fact that in our modern world of business is the way we create, generate value, distribute value in the world. So we need to get better at that for our own reasons and for our own success. The first thing you need to understand is that the work that we do, and by we, I mean the kind of people that are going to listen to a podcast on productivity, and I refer to that as knowledge work, as I have many times before. Knowledge work is not well understood. And what I mean by that is we don't know how we do it. So I'm trying to study it and figure out maybe not how we do it, but how we can get better at it. So after some years of study, and I'll detail what this is, I'm going to report out some of what I think I learned and a little bit more about why I do what I do. But what lessons can we learn from other human activities that help us get better at the knowledge work that we do for a living? Now, when I talk about better, I mean better. I mean faster, more accurate, fewer mistakes, more productive. In other words, we get more results per unit input. And I'm really working on this and have been for a while. And so this is kind of a report out, kind of an interim report out there. And the subcategory here is when I've studied getting better at things, it has become obvious that we really need to be careful about what we attempt to learn, about what we practice, about the areas in which we spend our time. We want to learn efficiently. And then we want to work as efficiently as possible. And so that's where we're at here, is how do we get better at what we do? Now, if you're not interested in getting better at your job, then you probably recognize that this whole line of podcasts is probably not your cup of tea, because I'm going to be pestering you to try to get better at what you do. And I think it's important. So that's where we're at. And again, to motivate getting better, if we get better at what we do, by my definition of better, then it's going to take us less time. We're going to produce more value. And then we're going to solve the challenging work problem, or at least then we'll have the capability. Because I think the overwork problem is caused by our lifestyle. So we need X amount of money. relative to everybody else in the world. If we could get that money faster, then we could work less. And working less is one definition of working better. So that's where I'm at here, right? And regardless of what you want, if you want more money, if you want to climb the corporate ladder, if you want to switch careers, whatever you want to do in your career, if you just want to have a fulfilling career rather than this drudgery crap, then I think learning more about how to get better at what you do is a critical skill. So self-improvement versus self-management. In particular, I want to think about tools and techniques. And the reason that I want to think about tools and techniques, there are several. First is we're all very well educated. Some are more well educated than others well educated, but we're all very well educated. You go to college, you get a business school degree, you understand how to do business and how things work, and you get out in the career world and you start doing it. And I think we tend to plateau at that point. So I'm going to try and help us get better. But I'm not positive that formal education, that at least more formal education, is the right way to go. Now, in the business world, the MBA is a good degree for certain kinds of people who have certain goals. But it's not, in my mind, it's not a generic degree. It's very expensive. And so is that the best thing to do to advance your career? Well, sometimes it might be, but you got to be pretty careful. So what can we do by ourselves without dumping another 50 grand into the educational system? So for now, I don't think that the answer that we're going to explore is, oh, you need to go get another degree. I don't think that's what we're doing. And in degree world, I put formal education, PDU kinds of things, continuing education in accounting, that kind of thing. I mean, it's a fine thing to do, and sometimes you have to do it, but is that how we're getting better at what we do? I'll also say that tools are really interesting, and to think about how important tools are, because the knowledge work world is just covered up with tools. All of our work in the knowledge work world is computer mediated, and we just have terrible. We have thousands of tools at our disposal. And, apparently the word processing tool has reached the state of its art, and it's the best tool it can possibly be because it stopped changing a long time ago. It stopped getting better. AI is present, and is that, this great productivity move? Maybe not. I'm on record with that elsewhere, but we just got tons of tools, and I'm wondering if learning tools is the right way to go about getting better. Learning to use tools. And I've got some different approaches, I think, that'll help us understand that a little bit. And I'm going to get that from my own history with sports and games, music, professional and formal and other formal education. So this is kind of my sandboxing, anecdotes from other people as well, because I've been looking into this for a long time. And I talk about it with a lot of people, and I'm a university professor, and in the business school, and just really have tried to see how this thing works. My dedication to figuring out adult learning is exemplified as much by the fact that I took up the bass. And my goal was, there was a gig that was there waiting for me if I could figure out how to play this thing. And so I spent a couple of years figuring out how to play it. And I'll tell that whole story, but it was a laboratory for me in adult learning. And I think our learning is very different once we graduate compulsory education, whatever we think compulsory education is. In some parts of the world, compulsory education is a very low level. In some parts of the United States, I think still high school is the limit of compulsory education. In some parts of the United States, in some families, it's college is compulsory. And so once we get done with that, then I think our learning changes or can change. And I've had plenty, as I mentioned before, I've had plenty of formal education. So, I mean, we can talk about that, but so in terms of a laboratory of myself, I think I'm pretty normal on the spectrum of human skills and abilities. I test out as a really high extrovert, but I'm not fabulously gifted in the IQ department as far as I know. I've done pretty well on standardized tests in history, you know, and I have certain skills like strengths finder and those sorts of things. But I mean, I certainly don't think that I'm extraordinarily gifted in any particular area. So I just am presuming that the things that happen to me are pretty common to human folks, rather than being extraordinary. And I don't want to get too carried away in, well, this is how I did it, but just trying to gather up some evidence and present that. The areas that I think are useful to look at, one area is sports. So we as Americans, we do a fair amount of sports, and we as a culture like sports, and our kids play sports, and I played some sports. And so this is learning, right? How do you learn to play sports? And a lot of this was when I was a kid. And so I'm going to attack this from kind of an odd way, which is to think through what's interesting to me in sport. Now, this is in fact idiosyncratic. This is just about me, and your experience may be very different. But um, I, I'm not anybody's like superstar athletic type. When you think about the athletic type, graceful, fast, endurance kinds of things. That's really not me. The closest I ever got to uh, being athletic was fairly strong physically. Spent a lot of time in the weight room when I was a kid. Um, so, I played lots of different sports, some in an organized fashion and some at a club level, lots of football, soccer, never played much in the way of baseball, played some tennis, I swam, um, these kinds of things, and just did a bunch of different things. And at the end of the day, probably football and soccer won out, and then that collapsed down into football, which then ended with an injury in high school. And then as an adult, sports have been, primarily golf. And again, I'm nobody's athlete. I don't like running. I don't like endurance sports. So, but I do look at the kinds of things that I like or am good at or whatever, and try to classify. And so you would see me doing things, golf. Always loved to play pool since I was a kid. Like to throw darts, these kinds of things. And so, as compared to like running, or, I did swim, but I was very much a sprint swimmer. The whole business of long distance, is just not my cup of tea. I don't know. I get bored too easily or something. So if you look at those kinds of sports, right, and then you get out into games that I like to play, and it's there's a certain thing that's going on, and so anyway, I kind of at one point I kind of thought that the games I liked, it was because the mental game, because the sports had mental game. Tennis has mental game. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think almost every sport has mental game, right? Whether they're athletic or not, there's mental game in sports. Um, a really interesting book about the mental game was The Mental Game of Tennis. If I'm going to use this, I need to get the reference. But anyway, so and then the other thing, I recall thinking one time that I didn't like games with defense because I wanted my performance to be my performance, right? Um, I was never, too many people surprised I was never a particularly good chess player, but and that's this mental game, right? So that's kind of what torpedoed that as well. But I was always fascinated about the fact that there's no luck in chess, and in much the same way, right? If you're shooting pool, there's very little luck. If you're playing golf, there's very little luck, right? I mean, the wind blows, sure, but you know, it has to be pretty serious in order for it to have a dramatic impact. Um, so get into these games where and playing against somebody else, playing against the defense is not luck, but you can't ever tell if your performance was because you were great or because the defense was terrible. And so I thought maybe that was it, but I don't think it turned out to be that way. Maybe that is, or maybe it's related. Um, and you think about defense, well, you know, games like uh tennis don't have a ton of defense. There's nobody trying to interfere with you as you try to do what you're doing, right? They hit the ball and put it where they think you can't get to it, so that's some defense. But I mean, in terms of, somebody guarding you while you try to hit the tennis ball, that just ain't there. Right. And then, so there's not a ton of defense um, in that sense. And then in golf, of course, there's zero defense. Um, you're not playing, the thing in golf is you're playing against the course, and the course can either defend itself or it can't, but the other players can't get involved, right? Um, so, the other component of the games that I like, or the things that I'm good at, is that there's a heavy technique component. Certainly golf is a technique game, and it may be related to the fact that there is time to consider one's technique. In basketball, they talk about shooting technique, but the rest is not heavy duty technique, right? It more relies on athleticism and speed and those sorts of things. Football, there are techniques, but it's certainly not as heavy technique as, for example, golf. And even pool is a heavy technique game. And it could be that that's just the package. That if there's not defense and there's not time pressure, then we've got time to or at least not that level of time pressure. Then we've got time to focus on technique and try and get things just right before we do that. And I've always kind of been a fan of technique. I always figured that the people that are good at this, your best bet is to try to copy what they're doing and learn how to do right. And there are problems with trying to learn technique that way. But it's so I think that was a big piece. Now I will say one thing about the sports that I like to play, and this is once I became an adult, right? I didn't get into an adult soccer league. I played golf and these other indoor sports, if you will. I never really paid for coaching, in terms of trying to get some help, and somebody else kind of influenced me on what I was doing. And that's particularly interesting because in technique games, that's what a coach does. In lesser technique games, a coach thinks about strategy. and again, it's a spectrum for all these things. Never paid for coaching. And so that's really one of the things that I wanted to explore when I took on this adult learning project. A little bit of a report out from what I learned from that as well. So kind of the nuts and bolts, I picked up the bass because I wanted to be more engaged and involved in the worship ministry at my church. I think I've talked about this on other podcast episodes, but I would sing. I was in the singing rotation, and that meant that I had a microphone in my hand once a month or maybe twice a month at most, but had really developed an appreciation for contemporary Christian kind of praise and worship music, and wanted to participate even more. And, if I could take some vocal lessons or whatever. So it turned out that bass was a place where they needed help. And so I had gotten a bass, and so I'm approaching this thing, and I'm going, okay, well, let's treat this as an exercise in learning as an adult, and let's be introspective about how it works and what's going on, rather than I was like everybody else in undergrad. It was like, oh, I just got to get through this. And I didn't care too much about actually learning anything. I just wanted to get the diploma or the degree or whatever. That changed a little bit, changed significantly, in fact, in MBA school. But still, that was that formal, college learning. Hey, you learn the stuff that's in the textbook. And so I was really excited to have the opportunity to study this with bass. I piddled around for a little while, but finally I did pay for coaching. And I got an online coach because of the pricing and the convenience of having a coach on the other end of my computer there. So Scott's Bass Lessons, if you're interested in learning how to play the bass, scottsbasslessons.com. Scott Devine and Ian Allison. No, wait a minute. Ian Martin Allison. Yeah, Ian Martin Allison are the guys that were leading there, and it's a great way to learn bass. So it was interesting because as a musician, and more background is, I never really had any formal musical education. I took a couple of years of piano lessons when I was a kid, but had never really done anything with a stringed instrument, much less an electric stringed instrument. So here I am with this bass in my hands. I generally know how to hold the thing, but that's about it. And so, got some coaching. Really went at it as a beginner. They said, okay, here's the first lesson, and I did the first lesson, right? That kind of thing and that structure. And I like that structure because it helps me to know when I'm done, right? and allocate my time effectively. So was doing that. And I was talking to some friends who were musicians, and some of them were bassists, and some of them were bassist wannabes, and some of them were just musicians, and talking about the stuff. And got a little help here and there, got some tips and some pointers, and certainly in the modern age, YouTube has no shortage of videos on whatever it is you might be trying to do. And people that are giving you coaching about it. And we'll get into what that is. But I kept trying to talk about it, and people are like, well, you'll just hear it. And that was frustrating me because I never have just heard it. I've been playing bass pretty seriously for 8 years now, and I still don't just hear it. I think when people say things like they just hear it or you'll just feel it, I think what they're trying to relate is a certain kind of musical skill, if you will. And so I'll draw an analogy here. But anyway, I won't draw the analogy because it'll take too much time. But people just hear it and they're like, these automatic musicians, and I'm not that. I'm not a particularly skilled musician. I can sing, and that's about it. And certainly no experience to speak of. So I'm doing Scott's bass lessons, and the the lessons are all about technique. It's like, no, wait a minute, I want to jam. I don't want technique, but I had committed to being a good student and taking the introductory material as a beginner. And so I was in the beginner lesson, and it's like, okay, well, here's the first lesson. Well, the first lesson had a lot to do with, what do you do with a guitar strap? And how do you hold the instrument? These kinds of things. As I went on through the lessons, Scott Devine is just, he's a maniac on technique. Absolutely dogmatic about, well, you got to learn the technique, and the technique is king, and all these sorts of ideas. And I mean, at the end of the day, what he said makes sense. It's hard to see how bad technique limits you, but it does, because the people that are really good at whatever you're doing don't appear to have lots of technique. I mean, certainly, they look like they know what they're doing. But I've never thought that anybody in particular looked, say, smooth or graceful or any sort of that thing. And so you kind of got to know what you're looking for in technique at some level to know when you see it. It's really interesting. But anyway, so it limits your ability to do certain things if you don't have the correct technique, because the people that are doing those things, the people that you're looking up to, part of the reason that they can do those things is because they have good technique, right? And so, and technique is boring, right? Nobody wants to practice technique. But so anyway, he was quite convincing on this. The other thing that was interesting to me is, technique is there to protect you from ergonomic problems. A lot in many cases. And so that was a thing to me, because I'm an older dude and I've had hints and allegations of some wrist problems historically, because I do a lot of typing for a living, a lot of sitting there. And so I didn't want to get any, repetitive stress, right? So that was a whole deal. He had a orthopedic doctor who specialized in hands and wrists, who's also a bass player, as it turned out, talk about this thing, which is fascinating. Technique actually impacts the sound that you make in the instrument. And not to get too much in the weeds, but the playing a stringed instrument is all about, putting the string on the fret. And if you miss that, then the note sounds funny. It's buzzy, or it's flat, or it's thunky, and you can begin to hear the difference, right? So since it's a physical thing, right? And I think we've lost sight of this a little bit, because a lot of the tools that we use and a lot of the games that we play don't have the technique as much, right? And by technique, I mean physical technique. And so, in terms of you can hit it too hard, right? So, I mean, if you're playing Xbox, you got an Xbox controller, you cannot push the button too hard. Okay, it has no impact, right? But in a real physical interaction situation, the technique does matter. I learned a lot. Technique is one of those big deals. As I alluded to before, some people will tell you, well, I just hear it. And I think there is such a thing as good musical sense. I think there's such a thing as a good musical ear. There's certainly such a thing as perfect pitch, which, if you don't know what it is, I won't bore you, but and there's people who are able to sing and people who are not able to sing, whatever that difference is. I happen to think that most people can sing better than they think they can, but the bar of what they listen to is so high that they're just intimidated by it. Anyway, and the people who say they can't sing have never really tried to learn. They're relying on innate talent, so to speak. And so, you know, so the, in the bass world, there's not really such a thing as kind of athleticism, and this goes back to sports. And this athleticism is going to be a key theme throughout this whole podcast. But it kind of goes back to sports. So certain sports, athleticism matters, right? And I kind of alluded to that, right? I mean, if you're playing tennis or basketball, football to a very large degree, you know, speed, agility, cardiovascular athleticism matters. Where if you're playing golf, athleticism matters less. You know, certainly at the amateur ranks where we ride around in golf carts all the time. You know, on the PGA, the guys have to walk, and you know, well, you know, I mean, it's a 5 mile up and down. It's more of a hike than a walk in a lot of cases. But you know, I mean, there's some level of athleticism and good balance and those sorts of things. But I mean, it's not like, you know, the highly athletic sports like basketball and soccer and tennis. And you know, music, of course, doesn't have any of that, right? It you know, hand-eye coordination and a musical ear are about as close as we get to that, you know, that analog of athleticism. But even in the area of you know, having a good musical sense, okay, there are people who claim that you can train your ear. I've done just a smattering of something that's called interval training, where you learn, and this is way too much theory, but you learn the distance between two notes, you know, and you dun dun, it's different from dun dun, and you learn to talk about those differences in practical ways. So, you know, if you're learning technique, it even helps in those areas, right? Like if you're playing a physical sport, you can improve your athleticism. Okay. And we'll have a lot more to say on this front, right? So then the question that you get into then when I'm learning this as an adult is, you know, can I learn it myself? And oh my word, this is the longest post in the history of posts. So all that's going to have to be cut down pretty significantly. You know, do we just should we just try to learn it ourselves? Can we just figure it out? And I'll say, I think athleticism interferes with that. I think people who are athletes kind of get things, people who are athletic kind of get things quicker. And the rest of us go, well, you know, I should get it quicker. Well, we don't. And that's like the people who, you know, just hear it in music. They have this musical sense. They're going to get it quicker, but that doesn't mean I need to get frustrated and can't do it. You know, and there are people that do things different. So I studied golf swing for, you know, 2 decades. And there are people that do it different and they're successful doing it different. But, you know, that's the exception rather than the rule. And so if you're going to be, you know, self-trained, right, you still probably need to think about technique. Okay. And if you want to play the odds are, you know, 9 out of 10 of the best golfers in the world have good technique. Like reliable, you could learn it, you could copy a technique, and 1 out of 10 or less has this real quirky thing that they do. So, you know, I'm moving into the I can't just figure it out for myself camp. And oh, by the way, why should I? It's expensive and it's slow, right? So, you know, another issue I think that we bump into with the bass, right, is as with any hobby sport, you know, musical, right, there are people that will sell you things. And so that brings up the whole issue of tools. And, you know, we live in a product society. Our standard of living is driven by product. and people's ability to sell us product. And so the sports world and the performance world is very much that same thing, right? I mean, certainly as a golfer, I was subjected to this kind of marketing. And the golfing industry, and it is not alone, makes a living off of folks who can't resist the temptation to try and spend a little extra money and get another 5 yards out of their golf club, right? And then the other interesting thing about tools is you can spend as much on tools as you want to spend. And I'm not against nice tools. I have nice tools. I have a nice base. I have brand name Fender base. I have another base. I actually have two. And the other one is a Marcus Miller base. If you know anything about kind of bass or that kind of music, Marcus Miller is a guy who you may have heard of. And so he started making basses, and so I bought one. And so, so having nice tools. Now I will say, there's a thing in the electric bass world, and that is you can play a 4-string bass, you can play a 5-string bass, and some people play both. But I went to 5-string, and it's a little more expensive. It's a lot more complicated. So I'm adding 25% more things I have to know. Okay. And in exchange for that, I'm getting probably, I'm going to say 3 additional playable notes, which constitutes about a 5% increase in the number of things I can do. So I've got 25% more complexity and 5% more flexibility. And that's kind of a bad trade-off. And, there are people that play 5-string basses out there in the world. God love you. I'm right there with you. I'm talking about like professional musicians. The overwhelming majority of rock and roll bass players play a 4-string. And so, again, tools, can you get a special purpose tool to help you do something? Yeah, but you're going to face that diminishing returns, right? And the bass is not the only example. I bought other tools that are special purpose, and at least I'm still playing the 5-string. Some of these other tools have gone by the wayside. I didn't spend a ton of money. I'm a older guy in my career, and I've got a little extra cash to throw around, so I didn't break the bank here. But could I have been more efficient? Yes, I could have, and taken that money and spent it on more lessons, right? More encouragement, more knowledge about what it is that I'm trying to learn to do. And it could just be, technique people in particular kind of games and sports that use tools. And I'm gonna bend this over to our work here in just a second. But I don't know if football players obsess over equipment. I don't recall obsessing over equipment when I was a football player. I don't recall being terribly concerned about what brand of helmet or what brand of shoes I had. Certainly didn't care about what brand of football. Well, golfers obsess about all those things. Golfers obsess about their clubs and the brand of gloves, what brand of ball they use, what shoes they have, all those sorts of things. And again, do tools matter? Yes, tools matter. Nice tools give us a psychological edge. If you like your tools, you're more likely to practice. And then, in certain areas, you got to have the right tool for the right job. As I've said before, if all you've got's a hammer and you need to pull a screw, then it's going to wind up being a mess. And same thing is true. So, you need to have the right thing for the job, but the right thing is not necessarily expensive. And it's also probably not a Swiss Army knife. And then finally, about tools, the best tools in the world will not save bad technique. Right. We fall prey to it and we think it might, and they explain to us how it could when they're trying to sell us this stuff. And occasionally we bite And occasionally we'll drop $600 or $700 on a new driver because we think it'll give us 5 additional yards, and invariably it doesn't. And so, it's just true that if you have bad technique, a good tool is not going to save it for you. Now, what about all this? So what about our knowledge work? What about the things that we actually do for a living? What do we need to be learning? How do we need to be going about learning so that we can actually get better at work? At the outset, I'll say what we do as knowledge workers is not well understood. How we do what we do is a mystery. The kinds of things, not creating PowerPoint, but coming up with PowerPoint content, not a programming language is not mysterious, but knowing how to solve programming problems is. And so it's not straightforward. Knowledge work is not straightforward. We've been thinking about this for a long time, and how do we help people do it better? Now, I banged on about tools because we have huge tool support in knowledge work world. All of our work is computer mediated. We have huge tool support. And so we can use, buy tools, get tools. Our company will buy us tools usually. There's all kinds of tools. Tool. Okay. Are they making us any better, or are they just confusing us? We spend a lot of time in our work on knowledge, on formal education kind of knowledge. And, I don't know that more education improves the situation. I mean, I certainly think you hit the law of diminishing returns pretty quickly. And so, you learn more and more about less and less, right? In programming, we call them edge cases that show up once every, 50 times, but you know how to solve them, right? Is it worth the trouble? In the knowledge work world, we don't have a lot of coaching normally. And by coaching, what I mean is, hey, let me observe what you're doing and give you some opinion on how you might do it better. Your performance evaluation system at your present job, assuming that you have one, is not this. So, how it's coaching is really not embraced. Sometimes in programming shops, you'll be able to pair program with somebody and get a mentor. And mentorship is usually more about connections, and I'm gonna say the political environment, than about what actually how to get better at your work. And so that we're ruling out a lot of things, right? A lot of things that we've tried and we've ruled out, but we haven't yet ruled out technique, because it's not something that is heavily invested in the knowledge work world. Technique. And when I say technique here, I'm not talking about expert knowledge of your field. I'm talking about how you apply that knowledge. Because if you stop and think about technique, in play in the bass, technique has nothing to do with which note you're playing, usually. It has everything to do with how you play each note. It has a lot to do with, what's the position of the instrument on your body? How do you not put yourself in a bad position by sitting down? Or if you're normally sitting down, by standing up, how do you not put yourself in a bad position? Right? This is technique. And there's not a lot of technique kind of conversation going on around knowledge work. And then the other thing that I think we need to be careful to notice is there is in other fields of human endeavor, there is this athleticism. And in music, it's not athleticism, but it's this musical ear. And so there are some talents and some training that lead us in the right direction. And I think that's true in knowledge work as well. I think that maybe the easiest observational thing is, there's people that just kind of get computers and how computers work. And they kind of, are quick on the uptake when they're presented with new computer tool. And so that's kind of this same thing that I'm talking about. And I struggle with terminology, but one of the things that comes back to me from time to time is this notion of athleticism, which technique and athleticism, that's where they correspond in the music world, right? So technique is, well, if in, say, an athletic sport, athleticism is loosely about being where you need to be in order to do what you need to do and getting there in time to do it, right? So tennis, athleticism in tennis is all about getting to where you need to be to hit the ball back well. In football, athleticism is all about being where you need to be in order to tackle the ball carrier or break up a pass play. Okay. In basketball, right? Athleticism is all about getting your feet underneath of you before you take a jump shot. Okay. And that's very similar to technique in music, because technique in music is about putting your hands where they need to be in order to execute what you need them to do. Okay. And so I think that there's a athleticism metaphor to the kind of work that we do. And then when I say technique, I don't mean tips and tricks. Tips and tricks are not technique. And I'll take you to the bass world. If you pluck a note on the bass and then you move down one string and 2 frets over, you get a very pleasant note that goes very well with the first one. Okay, that's a tip. And when we look at knowledge work world and we look at computer and people say, well, productivity tips and computer tips, and here's how you use a computer. Well, the plural of tips is not methodology. Okay. And so, here we are, and we need to, when we're looking at knowledge work, right? So I think it's very clear in knowledge work that we need to be thinking through what happens with our attention. And it's easy for our attention to get wandered off and not be where we need for it to be in order to do what we need to do. And so I think about that, and I think about our information and how it moves around. And so I'm pretty close to, in knowledge work, I'm pretty close to thinking that there's this notion of, informational and attention athleticism. And we're born with, or we're developing this set of skills that has us with our information and our attention where they need to be in order for us to do what we need to do. And if those things are, quote, out of position, right, then we struggle. And I think that's where technique may live, is, how do we do it? I mean, there's also a big chunk of technique that we get in formal schooling, depending on the work that you do. If you're an accountant, a good profit and loss statement is a technique. So you learn some of that sort of stuff. But then, relative to computers and relative to generic knowledge work, I think there's this athleticism and technique that we need to have and apply. And I think, well, in the interest of keeping this as short as possible, right? So Informational athleticism. Okay, well, what do we do about it? Well, I hope I've convinced you that that's an area that we need to work on. I don't think we need more tools. I don't think we need more formal education, most of us. You know, if you have not had the education that teaches you how to be an accountant and you want to be an accountant, then certainly go get that education. But I don't think more education is going to, right, move the needle hugely. Could be wrong. And so then where do we want to focus? Well, we want to focus on technique. I think we want to focus on this underlying skill that I call informational athleticism. Certainly, I think we want to manage our attention and make sure it's where it needs to be when we need for it to be there, and to not ignore that. And I think that we should take a solid look at coaching, because particularly in this informational athleticism piece, it's an observational thing. It's not nearly as structured as learning how to be an accountant. And so, you know, a coach will kind of look at what you're doing and give you their opinion of, you know, areas in which you could conceivably improve. So I think if we do those three things, I think if we focus on technique, I think if we consider our informational and attention athleticism, and I think if we investigate coaching, then I think that's certainly the correct approach, at least for now, while we continue to get this knowledge work thing sorted out. As you might expect. So again, okay, think about technique. Don't sleep on technique with what you're doing. Okay, get very fluid with your tools. Okay. Learn to deal with the tools well, right? Craftspeople are very careful to keep their tools organized and sharp. And so you'd do well to think the same way. Certainly scientific pursuits, because we think that the tools will solve the problems in science and more scientific pursuits. So something to think about there, and I'll reword that. And then, you know, I talk to people all the time and they go, well, you know, what's the tool? Well, it's not about the tool. Okay, you don't need a different kind of golf ball and you don't need different kinds of shoes. Right? What you need is to spend some time working on your athleticism and your technique for being able to handle the things that are in your world. And that's my opinion. And certainly that's why Attention Compass is what it is we go straight to technique. We go straight to attention. You know, is your attention where you need it to be when you need it to be there? And is your information the raw materials of your thing? You know, I mean, if you were if you were a carpenter of some variety, and you know, every time you needed a piece of wood, you had to walk a half a mile to get it. It would not be hard for anybody to walk into that situation and go, oh, hey, I see where you can improve your thing. And so as knowledge workers, our raw materials information, and we need to have it where it needs to be. And so ways to manage that. And again, this is back to technique. And with Attention Compass, we'll teach you the techniques for, you know, dealing with these ideas, and we'll begin to get that straightened out for you. So I think these are the ways that we approach getting better at what we do. We focus on technique. We look for coaching, and we consider this notion of athleticism. And then I think this will make us better knowledge workers and give us better careers, and that'll help us solve the stress and the career problems that we have. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.